Good evening. On behalf of Eugene Water and Electric Board, I would like to welcome you to tonight's community forum, where we will be discussing the impacts of carbon legislation on the electricity sector. Our audience has a number of important guests with us, including EWEB commissioners who are in the audience, executives and board members from other utilities, a number of familiar faces, state, county, local government officials and employees, and various advocacy groups and interested individuals. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Several years ago, EWEB's commissioners officially adopted a resolution supporting carbon pricing legislation. As the local utility for both water and electricity, we recognize our important role in the stewardship of our climate and our other natural resources. We also play a critical role in the social and economic development and vitality of the community we serve. Over the next decade, EWEB has over $1.5 billion worth of electric resource decisions to make. Legislation has a big impact on those decisions. And the main reason why EWEB helped commission the study that you'll hear more about tonight was that $1.5 billion worth of decisions. Under the right market conditions, that includes technology-neutral, carbon-based pricing, EWEB will not have to choose between being environmental or economic. We can be both. And in keeping the electricity sector competitive, further electrification of the transportation and industrial sectors is also possible, helping Oregonians meet our overall carbon reduction goals. Tonight's program includes a presentation, a panel discussion, along with audience Q&A. I'd now like to introduce our program participants for this evening. First of all, presenting the results of a research study on the lowest cost carbon emission reductions in the Pacific Northwest electricity sector, I'd like to introduce Arnie Olson, who's a senior partner at Energy and Environmental Economics, also known as E3. Arnie was born and raised in Wenatchee, Washington. Won't hold that against you. He has over 25 years of experience in energy analysis and is highly regarded as an expert in the role of renewable energy in decarbonizing the electric grid. Mr. Olson has consulted extensively for utilities, electric system operators, project developers, electricity consumers, and regulators. Arnie, thank you for being here. Our panel includes 3 members. First, we have Representative Paul Holvey, who's been a member of the Oregon House of Representatives since 2004, representing District 8, which includes South Eugene, Veneta, Lorain, and the surrounding areas. Representative Holvey currently sits on the House Committee on Energy and Environment and Consumer Protection and Government Efficiency. He is the chair of the House Committee on Business and Labor and the co-chair of the Oregon Department of Energy Oversight Committee. Welcome, Representative. Our panel also includes Eugene City Councilor Alan Zelenka, who joined the City Council in Eugene in 2007 and was appointed by the governor to the Oregon Global Warming Commission in 2013. Councilor Zelenka was president of the Climate Trust and has been energy service leader for Kennedy Jenks Consultants for 10 years, and prior to that, worked for over 20 years at Emerald Public Utility District as their power manager and legislative affairs manager. As city councilor, Mr. Zelenka authored the Climate Recovery Ordinance, making Eugene the first city in the country to put its greenhouse gas reduction goals into law and require an action plan. And he helped negotiate the Senate bill that created the Energy Trust of Oregon. Councilor Zelenka, welcome. Finally, on our committee this evening, Jason Huser. Jason is the Policy and Government Affairs Program Manager here at EWEB. He's a native Oregonian, which is just that much better than you, Arnie, just so you know. Sorry, Jason. He's a graduate of the University of Oregon. He spent 20 years working in public policy, representing local government clients at the state legislature since 2001, and before that, serving as the legislative aide to U.S. Senator Ron Wyden in Washington, D.C. He is a board member of the Oregon Energy Fund, a 27-year-old statewide charitable organization providing energy assistance to thousands of Oregonians in times of unexpected crisis. Thank you, Jason. Finally, this evening, I'd like to introduce tonight's program moderator, Therese Hampton. Ms. Hampton spent 13 years at the Bonneville Power Administration in the roles of Vice President of Environment, Fish and Wildlife, Manager of Power and Operations Planning, and Manager of Transmission and Reserve Services. She also held the position of Managing Director of Hydro Regulatory Compliance with Pacificor. That sounds awfully exciting. Side note, sorry about that. And has also consulted extensively in the power industry. Presently, Ms. Hampton is the Executive Director of the Public Generating Pool and represents 10 consumer-owned utilities in Oregon and Washington, including EWEB, who serve approximately 1 million customers and manage over 6,000 megawatts of generating resources. Thank you, Therese, for joining us. Thank you all for your participation and interest in tonight's topic. We hope you enjoy the presentation, and it generates a lot of interest and participation. With that, I'll now turn the program back over to Therese Hampton. Therese?
Thank you, Frank. So now we get to move on to the agenda. A couple of things. The presentation that we're going to hear from Arnie is on the EWEB website, so you can go back to it after tonight and look at these slides. You also can see there's a videographer. It's being videotaped, and that video version will be on the website as well. I'm going to transition in a moment to have Arnie give the presentation. We're going to ask during his presentation, no questions during the presentation. A lot of times he can answer maybe a question you have in the following slide, but we'll give some time for clarifying questions after his presentation. I am going to set up a little bit of the reason behind this study. As Frank mentioned, I am Executive Director of Public Generating Pool, a group of 10 consumer-owned utilities. We partnered with another consumer-owned utilities and Energy Northwest to do this study. And a little bit of background on the study. This group of 10 consumer-owned utilities, they're fairly diverse. There are east side utilities and west side utilities, rural utilities and urban utilities. And the question of how to deal with carbon is not seen uniformly within a group that diverse. But it continues to come up in legislative conversations, and the group really wanted to know how to engage in those legislative conversations. And so although the utilities are very diverse, the one thing that they all do every day in their jobs is they look at how to serve their customers in the least cost manner. So we adopted that philosophy of least cost and said, what if you applied that to carbon emission reductions? If you accepted carbon emission reductions as an objective, but said, we're going to look at it through the lens that we use in our day-to-day work and put a least cost application to it. So we hired E3 and asked them to put together an analysis of what different policies, how can you achieve least cost approach to carbon emission under different policies. And so that's what Arnie's going to present to us today. And again, hold your questions until he's done.
Great. Well, thank you, Therese, and thank you, Frank, for that kind introduction. Frank was kind enough not to mention in this heart of duck country that I'm also a proud University of Washington Husky. And to make things worse, I live in California now. But my name is Arnie Olson. I'm a senior partner with E3. Frank gave a little bit of background about my firm. I just wanted to sort of mention a couple of studies that we've been involved with that I think have helped to set us up to do this one pretty well. We do a lot of work on deep decarbonization. And what that means is looking economy-wide at how an entire jurisdiction, a state, or a country can meet goals like the ones set out initially in the Kyoto Protocol of 80% reductions below 1990 levels by 2050. So just a couple of examples of that. we were involved with the United Nations Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which led up to the COP21 meetings in Paris a few years ago. And we led the team that developed the United States version of that model. And there were 14 or 15 other countries, teams from other countries around the world that participated in that. And all those findings were made public as in the lead up to the COP21 meetings. I've done a number of studies for New York as well. We're doing one for Maryland now. I've done them for the various California energy agencies, and I've also been involved in studies of how to run power grids at very high levels of renewable penetration, including a 100% renewable study for the state of Hawaii, and we've done some 100% or close to that type of work for California as well. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, and because of my background up here, I tend to do a lot of work up here in the Northwest as well, and the Northwest power system is different because of the dominance of hydro. And so you'll see that coming out in some of the results that I'll show you today, as the hydro really shapes what types of things you want to add to the system up here. It makes it different from California and other regions that we've studied. There is a lot of very detailed technical information in this study and in this deck, and I apologize for that. Some of it might be necessary to really help understand what our findings are, but I'll try to sort of go through it at the right level. Just to give you a sense of where I'm going to go with this, I have a little bit of background material to share with you. Then I'm going to walk you through what I call the portfolios. So these are the scenarios that we modeled on the Northwest grid, and just sort of show you physically what's going on in these cases. Then come back afterwards and compare the cost and emissions impacts from those cases that we ran, all kind of side by side, so you can see what they're doing relative to each other. And then there's one sensitivity analysis that I want to show you in particular, which relates to what's the value of existing zero-carbon hydro and nuclear assets in the Northwest, and how do those play into this long-run goal, and then some conclusions and key findings at the end. So moving into some of this background. So as Therese said, the point of the study is to look at how Washington and Oregon can meet their long-run carbon goals in the electric sector. Both states have been looking at cap and trade, carbon tax, various different measures to set us on the path towards meeting those long-run goals. We took 80% below 1990 levels as kind of our base scenario that we built everything off of. And on the upper right-hand side there, you can see what that looks like for our region, economy-wide. Here's our historical emissions. Right now, we're almost back down to 1990 levels. So we've made some progress, but a long way to go, obviously, to get to that 2050 goal. So we're looking at questions like, how can we reduce carbon at the lowest cost? What's the role of wind and solar and storage and natural gas and hydro and all those other technologies that are out there? Just to give you a little bit of context about carbon in the electric sector, the bottom right-hand chart shows the different sources of carbon in Washington and Oregon, and it shows that the transportation sector really is the largest source of carbon. About 40% of the carbon in this region comes from cars and trucks, trains and planes. Electricity is a relatively small contributor, and that's because of the resource base that we build off of in the Northwest. Stepping back a little bit and thinking economy-wide, so this carbon isn't really an EWEB issue. It's not a Northwest electricity sector issue, it's really a global, national issue. So I think it's important to understand. This study dives deeply into how it affects the power sector in the Northwest. But it's important to understand that in the context of the types of transformations that we would need to see economy-wide and across the entire nation. So I wanted to just give you a little sense of what we're finding from our deep decarbonization studies that we've done for a number of jurisdictions, and other researchers are finding in parallel studies that they've been doing. So what we find is there really are 4 major transformations that we need to make across the economy. We call these the 4 pillars. First one is we need to do just an awful lot more on energy efficiency than we have done to date. And the Northwest has a very proud legacy of being really aggressive and being a leader in the area of energy efficiency and conservation. But it's more important than ever to do that and to double down and to triple down on those efforts, because it helps you avoid investments in clean energy and all the transformation and distribution all the way down the chain. We need to electrify end uses in other sectors that currently use fossil fuels. So in transportation, we burn gasoline directly. In homes and businesses, we burn natural gas. We need to take many, if not most, of those end uses, convert them over to electricity. So electrify vehicles, convert from using natural gas for space heating and water heating to using electricity. We need to meet those new electricity demands with low carbon sources of power. And we need to squeeze existing carbon out of our existing electricity supply. So we need low carbon electricity, and we need lots of it. And then lastly, where there is still fuel demand left in the economy, and there will be some, supplement that fuel demand with sustainably harvested biomass-based fuels. And those could be liquid fuels for long-haul transport. They could be gasification of biomass and using the zero-carbon methane then within the existing natural gas distribution infrastructure. But some form of sustainably harvested biomass plays a pretty critical role in the difficult-to-decarbonize end uses. So in many of these, and certainly the ones in the middle, electrification and zero-carbon electricity, the electric sector plays a really, really big role. It really is the linchpin. And utilities like EWEB will be the linchpin of achieving these economy-wide goals. Now, I mentioned we need to have lots of zero-carbon power. I just have a little graphic here on what the sources of that zero-carbon power could be. Number one is renewable power. Hydro, wind, solar, geothermal, biomass. Another source of zero-carbon power is nuclear power. It can produce power around the clock. And another source is continuing to generate electricity with fossil-based fuels, natural gas or coal, and taking the carbon that comes out of the stacks and sequestering that carbon, injecting it into underground formations, and permanently sequestering it so it doesn't release back up into the atmosphere. Now, 10 years ago, when we first started to do these studies, these were all players. And I think it still is too early to dismiss any of these. Certainly in our region of the world, where we have such a vast abundance of renewable resources and a large and flexible grid, and given what's happened with wind and solar costs over the last 10 years, it makes the most sense to see how far we can get with those sources of energy, recognizing their limitations. Wind and solar are variable. They only produce when the weather patterns allow them to. Solar obviously only produces half the hours of the year. So we need to recognize those limitations and build a low-cost and reliable electric system around them. I think in other parts of the world, the Northeast, Russia, India, China, it may be too early to dismiss those other potential sources. But we didn't look at them as part of this study because we don't see them as live options for this region. As I mentioned, we're starting from a very good place in the Northwest. Our grid is in many ways the envy of the world. It's very low carbon. This is a graphic that shows carbon intensity in tons per megawatt hour. Blue is good and red is bad on this graphic. So we have really the lowest carbon grid in the world. And it's not just low carbon, it's low cost, and it's very, very flexible. And the reason for that is because of the endowment of hydro resources that we enjoy in the Northwest. So in the Northwest, about 59% of our energy comes from hydro. Our other sources of zero-carbon power, between biomass, wind, and nuclear, a little bit of solar, add up to another 14%. It means about 27% of our power comes from some form of carbon-based power in the Northwest today. So we're starting from a good place. And it turns out that in the Northwest, we can count the number of carbon-emitting generators, not quite on one hand or two hands, but pretty close. 9 coal-fired power plants are responsible for about 80% of the carbon emissions in the Northwest. And here's a list of them. They're in black there. Many of these are actually located outside of Washington, Oregon. They're in Montana, they're in Utah, they're in Wyoming, but they're serving electric loads within our core geography, so we have to count them. There are also 16 natural gas-fired power plants, and together they produce about as much energy as the coal plants do. But they only account for about 20% of the emissions. So natural gas is a much less carbon-intensive fuel than coal, and when it's burned in power plants, it's burned much more efficiently. So natural gas is part of the story, but really the big culprit here is the coal-fired power plants. And if our goal is to reduce emissions by 80%, you can see where those 80% largely are going to come from when we get into the modeling. And I'll just note that some of those are already scheduled to retire. The Boardman plant in northeastern Oregon, Colstrip 1 and 2 units in Montana, and the Centralia plant in Washington State are all already scheduled to retire, and that will take about 14 million metric tons out of the carbon budgets for our region. So just to give you a quick sense of what the analysis that we did, we used some specialized software that E3 developed that looks at how to do decarbonization in the electric sector with very high levels of wind and solar. It's very specialized to look at how wind and solar interact with each other and interact with electric loads and with the hydro and the other resources. We've used it in a number of jurisdictions, including California, Hawaii, and New York. Have a project now in Nova Scotia we're using it for. What the software does is it selects the least cost set of resources to add to the electric system over time. So it does simulations of how the electricity system in the Northwest operates, all the existing power plants, and it tests one at a time. If I add this kind of power plant or that kind of power plant, wind or solar or natural gas, here's all the stuff it can pick from, sorts through all those choices, and minimizes the cost of serving electric load over a 30-year period between 2020 and 2050. Okay, it complies with policy targets like a renewables portfolio standard or a carbon target, and most importantly is that it meets our electric system reliability needs, and this really comes into play in the modeling, as I'll show you, is we have to make sure that our electric system is reliable as it meets these policy goals. So there's some natural gas technologies it can pick from, renewables, energy storage, energy efficiency. It has a whole set of stuff that it can pick from. And there are 5 different types of scenarios that we ran. The first one is a reference case. So this case has today's legislation, today's policy, but it assumes that there's no new policy added. So the Oregon Renewable Portfolio Standard, the announced coal retirements, those are already in our reference case. We're already assuming those are going to happen, but we don't assume there's any new policy. And then we compare everything else to this case. We have 3 carbon cap cases that we model, where we assume that carbon emissions are capped at 40, 60, and 80% below 1990 levels. And I'm mostly going to focus in my discussion on that 80% case. It's the most interesting. And you can see over here, this is the carbon emission trajectory that we forced the model to meet. We modeled 2 different carbon taxes. These were based on proposals that were last year out there in the Washington legislature. And this is the specific carbon prices. And so the governor's tax started at a higher level and escalated slower. The legislative tax started lower and escalated at a faster rate. So we just modeled these exactly as they were written. This places a price on carbon, makes it more expensive to run coal-fired power plants, natural gas-fired power plants, and more economic to invest in wind and solar and other things that help you to avoid that. We ran 3 different cases where we just raised the renewable portfolio standard. So what an RPS does is it forces more renewable power onto the grid, wind or solar or geothermal, and that's really all it does. It doesn't look at coal or natural gas economics. It doesn't look at energy efficiency. It doesn't have anything to do with the existing hydro. It just forces these new resources onto the system. So we looked at 3 different cases regionally about what those policies would do. And then lastly, we looked at a case that the only thing that it does is prohibit the construction of new natural gas-fired power plants. So there are some ideas out there that, well, if we just don't allow any new gas plants to be built, then we'll be able to slowly wean ourselves off of natural gas and transition to a newer and cleaner sources of power. So we tested what this policy does just in isolation. All right, so then this next section, I'm going to walk you through kind of what is happening on the grid as we walk forward through time under each of these different policy mechanisms. So first, I'm going to talk about the cap and trade. Okay, and what the cap and trade does, basically it puts a price on carbon and drives the wind and solar onto the grid and drives the coal and gas off the grid just through pure economics. Okay, so if there's a cap out there, then a certain number of allowances are made available to the market. As the cap becomes more binding, the price of those allowances goes up. And so you see the carbon price go up and up and up until enough action happens to drive the emissions down to the level that you're trying to get to. That's basically how these kind of mechanisms work. So then you'll see this now over the next several slides. These are very technical, and I apologize for that. But what we have on the left-hand side here is these are the resources that we're adding to the Northwest system by 2050. So we're starting in 2020, adding new stuff between now and 2050, and this changes the way that the system works, changes the economics, changes the dispatch, changes the emissions. Okay, so this is our reference case here on the left. Now on the right-hand side is the 80% reduction case, right? And just to give you a sense on the colors, the gray is natural gas-fired power. The dark blue is wind. The orange there is solar. and the pink is our demand-side resources. So you can see the model picks a nice mix of all of those things in the reference case. It's a little heavy on the gas. It still adds 5,000 megawatts of new wind and solar to the grid to meet the current RPS standards that are out there. And just to give you a sense of how big that number is, today's grid is about 30,000 megawatts, let's say, for the Northwest. So it's kind of, over 30 years, it's kind of adding another 50% or so of resources as the region grows, right? As you move to the right, the cap becomes more binding and more clean energy resources are added. So you can see over here in this 80% reduction case, we have now, instead of 5,000 megawatts of wind and solar, we have 11,000 megawatts of wind and solar. So we've more than doubled the additions of wind and solar in this carbon cap case. Now we still need 7,000 megawatts of new natural gas resources, even in this capped carbon case, just for reliability. And I have a slide where I'll walk you through what the rationale behind that is. But basically our model says the wind and solar power don't necessarily produce the energy when you really need them. And for reliability, we need resources that can produce when it's really cold and really dark and really still. And I'll have a slide where I'll walk through that. You can see that there's a little bit of a reduction in the amount of natural gas. So the wind and solar do help you avoid building some natural gas. But mostly we are doing both. We're adding wind and solar because we like that zero carbon power. We're adding natural gas because we can turn it on when we really need to. Okay, now on the right-hand side over here is just annual energy production. Okay, so this is the stuff we're adding, the steel in the ground. This is over here is what they're actually producing and combined with the existing resources. So here you can see this big blue wedge is the hydro, and that still is the dominant source of power for our Northwest grid. This dark blue up here is the wind, and you can see as you go from the reference case to the 80%, that wind wedge is growing quite rapidly, and the solar wedge is growing quite rapidly. So basically we have hydro generation still is the dominant resource, but you have wind and solar growing and increasing in importance. And at the bottom here you see this little black wedge. This is where, remember, 80% of the emissions come from in today's grid is from this coal. And so what you see is as the wind and solar are being added, as the price on carbon gets higher and higher and higher, it becomes less and less economic to run the coal. So two things happen. You put wind and solar onto the grid, and you turn off the coal, and you turn on natural gas instead. And the combination of those two things is what allows us to meet, on this right-hand chart, this goal of 80% reduction below 1990 levels. So you see there's no coal at all left by the time we get to this 80% goal. And this is a nice, smooth transition that happens over 30 years. So this allows us to meet the goal at really a relatively low cost. And I'll get to the cost in just a little bit. So this is kind of physically what's happening on the grid under these carbon cap cases. Wind and solar come on, they displace coal runs less, gas runs a little bit more as you move from the reference case to 40%, and then as you have wind and solar coming on the grid, it starts to run a little bit less again. Okay, now this next set of cases are the carbon tax cases, and the way that they operate on the grid are very similar to the carbon cap. Except for here, we're now setting the price, and we don't know how much emission reduction we'll get. It just depends on what that price does to the relative economics of all the various things that we can add, right? But otherwise, it's still a price on carbon, still has the same sort of general effect on how things work. And in fact, if you look at these cases, you'll see they're very, very similar to the ones we saw on the previous slide. And here's our reference case again, 9,000 megawatts of gas, 5,000 megawatts of new wind and solar. As you move to the right, you get a little bit less gas and a lot more wind and solar. 9,000 megawatts in this case instead of 11,000. Still need the 7,000 megawatts of natural gas for reliability. Here's the energy production. And again, these charts look very similar. You still have hydro generation dominating. You still have wind and solar now growing in importance as you move from left to right. You see the coal, again, being completely eliminated from the grid as a result of the price that's placed on burning that resource. But you see, these cases don't quite meet the carbon goal because the tax level wasn't set quite high enough. You have to kind of guess. If you set a price and it's fixed over time, you have to kind of guess what the price would be to get to a certain level of reductions. And that's going to change over time because the cost of natural gas is going to change, and the cost of wind and solar and all the various things are going to change over time. So you're not quite sure what you'll get with a tax. Whereas with a cap, you can kind of set a level, and then the price will float and drive the behavior that you need to get to the emission level. But otherwise, these cases are, again, very, very similar. Now, this next set of cases are where we focus on the renewable component of this only. So this has been a policy that's been very popular around the country, very popular in the Northwest. It's been very, very successful at driving renewable energy onto the grid and really kickstarting this renewable energy industry and bringing them into maturity. So I think it's been very, very successful from where we sat 10 years ago when these policies were first being proposed and being implemented. But as you get to higher and higher levels of RPS, then because the policies aren't focused on carbon, they're focused on just pushing one set of resources onto the grid, they tend to have some unintended consequences, which I'll show you. So here now, as we go from a reference case RPS to a 30 and a 40 and a 50% RPS for the region, you see a really big change in the resource build. Now, instead of building 11,000 megawatts of renewables, we're building 23,000 megawatts of new wind and solar to get to that region-wide 50% RPS. And I still need 7,000 megawatts of new natural gas for reliability because really that's what's left over after the wind and solar have given that everything they can during those really cold, dark days. So a big now new build of renewable energy. And when it comes to production now, you see that reflected is that the wind production gets really, really big. And the solar production as well. Hydro is still big. So we end up with very large surpluses of wind and solar. So this black line here, I didn't talk about that before, but this is the annual energy demand in our core region. So you can see even in the reference case, we have a little bit of a surplus. And that's kind of common. In the Northwest, we're a hydro-dominated system. So we plan to have just as much energy as we need during a dry year, which means that during any other year, we have a little bit of surplus, which we sell to California, or we sell to our neighbors in Montana or Utah or wherever. And we get some revenue from that, which helps to keep rates low for ratepayers in the Northwest. So we do plan to have surpluses in the Northwest. But these surpluses are growing very, very rapidly, and they become just very extreme. So we end up, then this little red wedge up there is curtailment. So what that means is we end up during some hours having so much wind and solar that we can't use it all. So we have a surplus of it. Nobody else in the grid can buy it. They can't use it, or there's not enough transmission to get it to some other region. So we end up just having to basically spill it. So we just turn off the wind farms and the solar farms, and we don't use it, and that's okay. A little bit of that's fine. It's a little bit too bad that we built it and can't use it all, but this is the way that we keep the grid reliable. So it's an economic impact. Now, the other thing that you see on these charts is that coal generation continues to operate. Okay, so the RPS, it's good for wind and solar. It really improves the economics of wind and solar. It doesn't change the economics of coal relative to natural gas, which the carbon price does. So natural gas is still more expensive to run than coal. So the utilities, just by least cost dispatch, they'll run their coal plants first. And they'll run their gas plants if they need to. If I have some wind and solar, I'm going to turn my gas plant off and continue to run the cheapest resource that I have, which is a coal-fired power plant. So unless you do something to change that dynamic, you're pushing lots of renewables onto the grid, but this major source of carbon that sits at the bottom, the coal, is still there on the grid and still emitting. And here you can see the natural gas gets very, very small. We're almost squeezing the gas off the system and leaving the coal there. So as a result, you see that we end up with much higher costs because we're building so much hardware in these cases, but we're not meeting our emissions goal because the largest emitters are still on the grid and still running almost at base load as they do today. Now, I want to just make sure I note here that this 50% RPS, this is a region-wide RPS that applies to all the utilities. So Oregon has already passed a 50% RPS that applies to the private utilities, PacifiCorp and Portland General Electric. Now that's reflected already in this reference case here. Okay, so Oregon's 50% RPS as it's currently written, that's already here. This is just extending that then to all of the other utilities in the Washington and Oregon whole region. And that's what drives these big surpluses, is building that much renewables. And this kind of makes sense because if you remember, hydro was 59% of our energy today. So if hydro is 59%, now we're adding 50% wind and solar. It kind of makes sense that we end up with big surpluses. Okay, now you might ask, well, gee, if we have all this surplus energy, why can't we just build some energy storage, charge our batteries, and then use it later on when we need it? And in some places in the world, like California, that's a really, really good idea, very compelling, and the economics of that really play out very well. So what I have here is a day in the life of the California grid. This is a springtime day, and this is a 24-hour period there across the x-axis. On the top is just megawatts of generation. Here, this black line is load. The green is renewables that are delivered to the grid. The gray is natural gas again, right? What you see here, this red area is surplus solar power. This is a nice mild day in California. To build enough solar to hit a 50% RPS in California, we had to build a lot of solar that produces a lot of power during the summertime. And it turns out that on these nice mild spring days, we just have way too much solar in California under these kind of cases that we run. But you can see this solar surplus comes in this nice, very predictable pattern. Between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. every day on a low load day, I have a bunch of surplus. I can take 4 or 6 hour batteries, absorb a lot of that, and then use it at night when I still have some natural gas that I can turn off, right? So this makes a lot of sense in a solar-dominated grid like California. Now, the Northwest is different, as I talked about before, because of the hydro and because of the wind. So here's what our oversupply days look like in the Northwest. Okay, so this big light blue is hydro. Here I now have the blue for wind and the yellow for solar again. And this black line is the electric load in the Northwest, right? In the Northwest, our surpluses are driven by wind, which wind doesn't happen in this nice daily pattern like this where the sun comes up and down. It tends to be, it's windy for 3 or 4 days in a row, and it's still for 3 or 4 days in a row. So you tend to see multiple day oversupply events in the Northwest. We also tend to have oversupply during really, really wet years. There's a lot of water in the river, and I just have to keep flushing that water down through the turbines and making power with it because I have flood control issues, right? So there's just a lot of water in the river. So you might actually see this day, and here's a day where I'm curtailing now every hour of the day. And you might see this day in a wet year for 30 days in a row, or 60 days in a row. Or maybe not on, with the highest demand days, but you see these a lot, and they're repeated, and they last a long time. So the idea that 4 to 6 hour batteries are going to help soak up a lot of our renewable surplus, it works well in the Southwest, but it really doesn't work as well in the Northwest. So the conclusion there is that we think that current storage technologies can be really helpful, but we don't think they solve our problem in a big way like they do in a solar-dominated region like California. Okay, so the last case we ran was one where we prohibit the construction of new natural gas generation. And we're testing this now in isolation just to see what this policy by itself does. So here now is our reference case with the 9,000 megawatts of natural gas, 5,000 megawatts of wind and solar, and here's the no new gas case. So the purple is a new color here. The purple is storage. So the only resource that we have available that we assume can meet our reliability needs is energy storage. And the light purple is pumped hydro storage. The dark purple is battery storage. Okay. So what you see is, well, most of this gas goes away. It's replaced with energy storage. We don't see much of a change in wind and solar generation. We still have just about the same amount that we have in the reference case because there's no mechanism to make wind and solar more economic or to drive them onto the grid. So we see very little change in wind and solar. Our 7,000 megawatts of gas are replaced by 7,000 megawatts of pumped hydro and battery storage. Okay. Now on the right-hand side, this is our energy production. You can see this does very little to change the way that our grid operates throughout the year. We don't have any big new sources of zero carbon power coming onto the grid. So there's nothing there to displace the coal and natural gas that are the source of all the carbon emissions in the Northwest. It does help us soak up a little bit of that overgeneration, that oversupply of wind and solar when we have it, but otherwise it just doesn't do a whole lot. You still see relatively similar amounts of wind and solar, relatively similar amounts of coal and gas. And in fact, what we find is, by itself, the storage tends to increase the use of coal a little bit because it will charge with coal at night and discharge during the daytime when it can displace natural gas. That's what it does just based on pure economics. Coal is cheaper to run than natural gas. We actually see a little bit of decline in natural gas production as a result of adding this energy storage. So conclusions are really very little change in the amount of zero carbon power that we have on the grid. We see that the coal generation continues to operate and maybe even operates a little bit more. And the reason for that is storage doesn't produce energy by itself. Storage can store energy. You can charge it with wind, you can charge it with solar, you can charge it with coal, and then it can produce later on. But by itself, it's not a source of energy. It just shifts it from one time to another. Now, so this case is expensive and does very little to change carbon emissions. And there's another thing about it that I want to make sure to go through, is that we didn't study the reliability of the system in a lot of detail for this. That's a different kind of study. We made the assumption when we constructed these portfolios that 10 hours of storage could replace dispatchable natural gas generation on a one-for-one basis, would be equivalently reliable to natural gas generators. But we didn't test that proposition specifically. That's a different kind of study. But I do have a lot of worry about whether that really is the case, which I'll show you here. So in the Northwest, the most challenging conditions for the power system are when it's a drought year, and especially when it's towards the end of the winter and you have a multi-day cold snap. So these are the kind of conditions that Bonneville Power Administration has planned for many, many years. That 1937 is the drought year that's kind of the worst on record. So they plan to make sure that they have enough power to meet all of their loads during a 1937 water year. And the condition that's most challenging for them is in March. It's the end of the winter. The reservoirs are empty. The spring runoff hasn't started yet. And is there enough power in the system to meet demands during this multi-day cold snap? So this is a day, we didn't have this day in our simulations that we ran just to put together the portfolios, but I'm worried about this case. So we went back and looked at other days from the historical record and sort of modeled the portfolio that we developed here on those other days, just to kind of see what these days look like, okay? So this is a high demand event, a very cold day in the Northwest. Here's our hydro in blue. The dark blue is wind. The orange is solar. On the bottom here are the nuclear and geothermal, okay? And in the middle we have natural gas. So we're assuming all the coal's gone in this case because we took our 80% carbon cap case, which didn't have any coal in it. So we're meeting all that incremental demand with natural gas here. Now, what happens when we take that natural gas away? So now we have an energy shortage that happens all day long. And again, these cold snaps tend to come in multiple day events as well. You have 3 or 4 days in a row where it's the high pressure zone sits in, it's clear, but it's really, really cold, and that happens for a few days in a row. So you might have a few days in a row where you just don't have enough production from your hydro and your wind and your solar. Now you say, well, what if we just built more wind and solar to help us charge the batteries, to help us keep water in the reservoirs to help meet demand? Well, look what's happening to our wind and solar production on this specific day. So again, this is a real day that we went and gathered from the historical record. And I don't remember which day it was, but I think it was in 2016. Here's the total production capacity from hydro, 32,000 megawatts. And here was the actual production on that day, about 14,000 megawatts. Okay, so this is a dry year. It can't produce at its nameplate capacity. And that's normal for hydro. It's very few times when it actually gets anywhere close to the maximum there. But it's still giving us a lot of energy, right? The wind and solar really aren't giving us very much. Again, these cold weather events tend to be still. There's not a lot of air movement, not a lot of wind power being produced. They're also in the middle of the wintertime, so the sun is at a low, even if it's sunny, it's at a very low angle, and you only have a couple hours a day where you have very much production at all. So the wind and solar just really aren't giving us very much energy production on this day. And so that's why I worry that without some form of dispatchable generation, that we're just not going to have a reliable power system. And, and I'll note that this isn't just an issue for this study and for the Northwest. There's a lot of researchers out there trying to solve this problem. And they're looking at things like chemical storage, compressed air storage, making hydrogen maybe, and using it, burning the hydrogen in power plants later on, multiple day, multiple week, multiple month storage. But there's not technologies out there that are commercial today. So maybe in 10 years or 20 years, there'll be new technology that helps us solve this problem. So just to walk through then what the cost and emissions impact are of these cases. On the x-axis, reductions in CO2 emissions, and on the y-axis, annual incremental cost by 2050. Okay, so the reference case is over here at the 0 point. We're comparing everything else to the reference case. That's current policy through 2050. Here's our carbon cap cases. Our 80% reduction case, we get exactly to the goal line because we forced the system to get there. And the cost of that is about $1 billion per year of an increase relative to the reference case by 2050. So just to give you a sense of how big that number is, the total electric cost in the Northwest is about $19 billion. So it's about a 6% increase in total electricity system costs relative to the reference case. And this is a 30-year transition, so we get to sort of experience that increase gradually, 6% over 30 years. So I think by most definitions, people will consider this to be a pretty reasonable cost for meeting our international commitments of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. The tax cases are, and again, they behave very similarly to the carbon cap with respect to what they do for the system. They don't quite get us all the way to the goal. If we'd had the tax a little bit higher, they might have got us all the way there. Otherwise, they're relatively low cost, and they get a lot of emission reductions. Our RPS cases kind of go off in a different direction for all the dynamics that I talked about. They push wind and solar onto the grid, but they don't help us take coal off of it. So our 50% RPS case costs about twice as much as the 80% reduction case, but it only gets us about half of the emission reductions. So it's really focusing only on investing in new renewable generation and not on all of the other things that can also help us to reduce emissions, in particular the relative economics of coal and natural gas. And then finally, our no new gas case costs about the same $1 billion as our 80% reduction case, but it does very little to reduce emissions. It gives us more expensive and potentially less reliable capacity. Okay, there's a table here for those of you that like numbers rather than pictures, and I'm not going to go walk through every number on this chart, but it'll be there for you to stare at later on if you want. The very last case that I'm going to show you tonight is what happens if we take existing zero-carbon resources off of the system. So for this case, what we did was assume that we were retiring the one existing nuclear plant in the Northwest, which is the Columbia Generating Station, and 1,000 megawatts of existing hydro. And we didn't pick names on the hydro. We just scaled the whole hydro fleet down by about that amount. So what happens if you take this 2,000 average megawatts of existing zero-carbon resources off the system? What does that do to our ability to meet our carbon goals in the long run? So we tested it both under the reference case and under the case where we meet the carbon cap. And what we find in the reference case, remember, so this is, again, current policy. So there's no new carbon policy. There's no carbon goal. There's no new RPS here. Take the hydro and nuclear off, and what we replace it with is gas. That's the cheapest resource. We can basically replace it one for one with natural gas. We take 2,000 megawatts off, build 2,000 megawatts of natural gas. The cost of that is $1.1 billion per year by 2050. So just replacing these resources, not even their zero carbon attributes, but just replacing their power attributes, costs the same as meeting our 2050 emission goals of 80% reduction below 1990 levels. And by the way, carbon emissions increase under this case by 5 million metric tons because we're having to burn a bunch of new natural gas to make up for the power that we lost. Now, let's test it under that 80% carbon reduction case. So here now we're forcing the emissions not to go up. So we have to do other stuff besides just build gas, right? So in this case, now we're building a lot more wind and solar. In fact, we're building 5,500 megawatts of new wind and solar to replace the 2,000 megawatts that we lost. Oh, and by the way, I'm still building that 2,000 megawatts of natural gas because I still need that for reliability for all the reasons that we just talked about. So I have to replace the zero carbon attribute with wind and solar. I have to replace the reliability attribute of those resources with new natural gas. So I end up with about 3 megawatts of new investment for every megawatt that I lose. So this ends up costing an additional $1.6 billion per year by 2050. So instead of costing $1 billion or a 6% increase in cost to meet the 2050 emissions goals, now it costs $2.6 billion or maybe a 14 or 15% increase in electricity costs. So just to walk through the conclusions, I think we've been through most of these already, but just to summarize them here, the lowest cost way to reduce carbon in the Northwest is to replace coal with a combination of energy efficiency, renewables, and natural gas resources. And we think that the best way to do that is through some form of an economy-wide price on carbon. And the more broad-based you can make this price, the better off we are, the more opportunity we have to seek out low-cost emission abatement opportunities. Economy-wide is better than electric sector only. Multi-state, multi-region is better than single state. The bigger region you have to go find least cost ways to reduce carbon, the more success you'll have at doing it at a low cost. Number 2, renewables will play a critical role in all these cases. We see a huge future for wind and solar and geothermal and biomass and hydro in all these cases. But we find that an RPS policy mechanism leads to higher costs and is less effective at reducing carbon. And what's more, it has some unintended consequences, like suppressing wholesale market prices and making it more difficult for owners of existing zero carbon resources to reinvest in those aging facilities. Number 3, prohibiting the construction of new natural gas resources doesn't do much to limit carbon. It does drive up costs, and we're not sure that this electric system will be reliable. We think more study is needed to determine what we would need to actually make this system reliable. Just because you build the gas plants doesn't mean that you have to run them very often. So the best case here is I build them, I have them there when I need them, but I have lots of wind and solar and other resources to not run them. I only run them when I absolutely have to. And that's consistent, by the way, with the least cost pathway to achieving these long-run emission reductions. Retiring existing hydro and nuclear generation make it much more challenging and costly to meet zero carbon goals. And I've got a few that we didn't really talk about but are in the study. This one has to do with what happens to the revenue from a carbon tax or for a carbon cap and trade. It's important to keep that revenue home in the electric sector so that ratepayers aren't paying twice. Once, a tax on emissions, and secondly, for all the wind and solar and other stuff they have to build to reduce emissions. Energy efficiency is very important, and there's a lot of R&D that's needed on the next generation of energy efficiency measures. And then lastly, vehicle electrification and electrification of the other sectors of the economy is a really important tool. Another way that the electric sector will contribute also needs more study and more research.
Howdy. 2 clarifying questions. One is, in your storage and solar modeling, did you assume any difference between utility scale and rooftop or household level?
We didn't. So we would basically assume that even if it was at the household level, that it would be responsive to the needs of the grid and dispatched optimally. Now the reality is that's not the case. If you have a storage that's behind the meter, what customers will do is use it to minimize their own bill, not minimize the cost to the grid. But we made the optimistic assumption that it would be used optimally.
And my second clarifying question is, did you consider the changing climate in the modeling here for things like population growth, solar, water in the wintertime, lack of water in the summertime, and changing load times?
Yeah, that's a great question. On the population growth, we do have some load growth that's built into our study, but we didn't look at what happens if the hydro system, if we have more rainfall and less snowpack, and the changing shape of the hydro system. That's just one level of complexity beyond what we could do in the time frame that we had.
Hi. Oh, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very helpful, tricky modeling, and the wonderful world of modeling can often get us in trouble. So I want to ask you a couple of questions.
Okay.
One is, particularly with respect to the fee or tax rates, why did you not model it where it did meet the 80%?
Well, we have a case that does meet the 80%, and that's the carbon cap case.
Correct.
So
I'm addressing the fee side.
yeah. So what I was going to say is we can pull out of that what the tax would need to be to actually get you to that. So we had a case that we could see what was happening and we could see what the cost of it was. So then to contrast that, we just modeled the taxes as they were specifically written.
Okay, thank you very much. Secondly, I wonder whether or not it wouldn't be better just to throw away the less than 80% cases and focus on the 80% case. There you could use your modeling power to look at changes in battery costs across time. There were several gaps for me in the model that didn't quite work. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just on that, we did include in our projections a pretty dramatic reduction in the price of lithium-ion batteries as well as solar and wind resources. But you're right, the 40 and 60% cases don't end up being very interesting. So I only end up ever talking about the 80% case.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I can tell you put some real resources into it, and I appreciate the presentation tonight. My question, you have that great chart about California and the surplus power they have, and obviously California, I think it was 17. California obviously is interested in greater regional integration so that they can either sell us very cheaply or give us that power, which they're now giving for free or even paying Arizona to take from time to time. That's at about 27% renewables in the state, and they have a law to go to 50% by 2030. So that big curtailment area is going to get even bigger over time. But it looks like your model may not have really looked too much at opportunities for greater integration with California, and I wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, it does a little bit. In fact, what you see here is we have some solar, but we're curtailing a lot more during the middle of the day, during what look like the solar hours in the Northwest. And that's not at all how it happens today. So in the Northwest today, we end up curtailing at night when the loads are really low and using all of our power during the middle of the day. So we do have a West-wide model. So we are modeling the effect of California's surplus as it affects the economics of adding new solar and wind and how the Northwest grid is operated. Now, these models tend to assume that everything kind of happens perfectly on the grid. And so they're very optimistic with respect to how much renewable energy the grid can absorb. In reality, there are lots of reasons why the system doesn't work perfectly efficiently and perfectly optimally. And that's why we're seeing curtailment of solar, not today, but in 2017 we saw quite a bit of it in California, even while we had some natural gas running for reliability, even when we had imports coming in from other regions in California that for some reason couldn't be turned off. So the system doesn't work as optimally as our model would assume. But all those dynamics of California, Northwest, solar, wind, those are all incorporated.
Okay. So when you were gathering all your figures about natural gas, were you including leakage all the way from coming out of the ground through the pipes and everywhere else in your calculations? And also the other half is pump storage. There wasn't much in there about pump storage. And you could use some of that excess to pump water up and down hills and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with respect to your first question, we are using the accounting practices that are used by the state agencies, so by the Department of Ecology, by the California Air Resources Board, and those measure emissions at the smokestack only. They don't include life cycle, all the way up the chain. I mean, there definitely is an issue with natural gas. It's also a big issue with coal. So with respect to the coal to natural gas trade-off, there's a lot of mine mouth and coal bed methane emissions that aren't counted in those inventories either. But with respect to so if and when those emissions are counted in the inventories that Washington and Oregon are using for their regulations, then we could incorporate them here. But we're using here the inventories that are accepted by the state agencies. I'm sorry, your second question on pump storage. The pump storage projects that are out there today are basically daily diurnal cycle pump storage. So we're seeing 6 hour, 8 hour, maybe 20 hours. But we're not seeing proposals for weekly, 1 week, 2 week, 1 month duration pumped hydro reservoirs. So maybe as this problem becomes, not this one, but the reliability problem becomes more understood and more binding, we'll start to see some of those proposals. But the resources that are out there now are more like batteries, and as a result, they just don't help us that much.
Two related questions. One, what's your assumption about where the new renewables will be? Are they in the Northwest? Are they in Wyoming? Elsewhere? And related to that, what are your assumptions about what other states in the Western grid are likely to do, such as the Salt Lake Provo area?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so with respect to renewable supply, we looked at a number of different, I think we have 10 or 12 different renewable energy zones in our model. So we have a couple of different zones with more Columbia Gorge wind. We have a southeastern Oregon wind zone. We have a Montana wind zone and a couple of different Wyoming wind zones. And the different zones might have different levels of transmission investment that would be assumed to be needed to be able to deliver all of that energy to Washington and Oregon. We have different eastern Oregon and eastern Washington solar zones and a west side solar zone as well. So it's quite a variety of different resources that are available. The good news is that there's a lot of supply out there. There's no shortage of wind and solar to meet these levels of demand by any stretch of the imagination. And we actually have access to a pretty nice, diverse set of resources as well. The Montana and Wyoming wind profile is very different from the Gorge wind, very complementary. The solar plays nicely in there as well. So supply is not really an issue. We have a nice, rich available. I'm sorry, your second question was?
How you factored in the demand from other portions of the West?
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, so again, for California, we assume that they're going to 50% RPS. For all of the other states, there are some projections that are put out there by the Western Electric Coordinating Council of how each state is planning on meeting its RPS. So we assume that there's lots of renewables being built in other states as well. And those are kind of the backdrop. We freeze those and hold them constant for all of our cases. But again, there's lots of resource out there for all of the West to meet its goals.
The first pillar that you presented for carbon reduction was energy efficiency and conservation. And the first recommendation that you made had to do with energy efficiency. So why aren't a variety of conservation measures included in your model?
Yeah, so you might recall the sixth finding, key finding, which is that more research and development is needed on the next generation of energy efficiency measures. So what we did here is we incorporated in all of our scenarios all of the conservation potential that the Northwest Power and Conservation Council has identified as being cost effective. So that's an awful lot of energy efficiency that's built into all of our scenarios. Now we worked closely with the council staff, and they gave us all the data on all of the other stuff that they didn't pick. So we put all of that into our model and allowed the model to pick those additional measures if it was economic to do so. In most cases, it wasn't because what they gave us was very, very expensive. Now, we think there just hasn't been enough research done on what's cost effective, ground source heat pumps. There's a whole lot of technologies out there that are being used in Europe that really haven't been studied for use in the U.S. So we think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to be had there on additional energy efficiency measures, but we didn't have the data to characterize them for this study.
Okay, we're going to take one last question before we move to our panel.
I gather that you are advocating for a pricing mechanism, and you're very aware that there's been a lot of effort in Oregon and several of the other states to incorporate that through legislation. What's unclear from your presentation is what you would really advocate for, but mostly when you compare tax versus a cap and trade mechanism, which is what we're finding in the legislature. One party is saying, now they want a tax because the cap and trade is moving forward, but your methods and presentation doesn't really talk about what percent that would be comparison with each other. There have been some studies, but when you model this one way or the other, you say either one works, but it sort of works differentially, doesn't it? It depends a lot on what that tax rate is and where that tax money goes on either one. Mm-hmm. If you call the cap and trade a kind of a component of a pricing mechanism. Mm-hmm. Could you expand on the difference between those policies? Because we're just about to head into a session and we're advocating with legislators and we're getting pushback that now they want the tax where previously they hadn't. But what argument or what advocacy can be brought to bear based upon the studying that you've been doing?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to just clarify with respect to the prelude to your question that I'm just the technical analyst. I'm not advocating anything. I run the numbers, and I show you how the numbers come out if you make various different kinds of assumptions. Therese will probably want to jump in and clarify that even her members aren't necessarily using the study to advocate for anything. So, all right, as long as that's out of the way.
We're simply using it to inform policy positions.
Now that that's out of the way, so when we run the numbers, they look the same. But what that glosses over is all kinds of implementation details, right? And to me, when I look at this, just from a personal perspective, I see a lot of reasons to favor a cap and trade versus a tax from an electric sector perspective. And I talked a lot about making it broad-based. So if it's a tax, the only opportunity you have to look for ways to reduce your tax incidence are in-state. You don't have the opportunity to look at other states, to link up with other cap and trade programs like you have in RGGI in the East and the ETS in the EU. The Western Climate Initiative is now California and Quebec and Ontario, and they're able to trade across boundaries. So that's a big benefit to me at achieving least cost emission reductions. The other thing is that within the power sector, if you have different prices for carbon in Washington and Oregon and California and then and BC and then a zero price everywhere else in the Western grid, it really makes it difficult for power operations and wholesale power trading, which all of the utilities in the region rely on to help keep their rates low. So it really makes it's administratively very, very challenging and really kind of throws a big monkey wrench in the way we've ran the power grid for the last 30 years. I don't think that is really widely understood in the legislative arena. So I'm hoping that some of Teresa's colleagues in the utilities can help make those points clear. The third point that I would like to make is the fifth finding was on making sure that ratepayers don't pay twice. Okay, so this is where now if there's a tax, then I have to pay as a utility taxes on all of the emissions that I generate. But then I also had to pay for all the wind and the solar. I have to pay to burn gas instead of coal, all the compliance measures I have to make. So I'm paying twice. I'm paying once for the tax and once for all the compliance measures. Now, in other systems, in other jurisdictions, when they've implemented carbon pricing mechanisms, they've found a way to take that revenue that's generated from the electric ratepayers and keep that home. So the way that works in California is the utilities get free allowances. They have cap and trade. Utilities get free allowances. They sell those allowances in the auction, and everyone in California gets a credit on their electric bills exactly equal to what the utility sold. So there's a direct mechanism for that to flow back to ratepayers so that ratepayers only pay once. So to me, that mechanism feels a lot more secure from an electric ratepayer perspective if it's a cap and trade and my utility is getting free allowances versus if it's a tax and that money is going into the general fund and now it's being used to fund schools and roads and everything else that's not necessarily related to carbon or to electric utilities. So those are, from my perspective, maybe three reasons to favor a cap and trade over a tax, just qualitatively.
Great. Thanks, Arnie. Thanks for the questions. Again, we'll be able to ask questions after we hear from our panelists. And so we're happy to hear from our panelists to respond to the presentation and talk a little bit about how greenhouse gas emissions are important in their respective area of representation. And we're going to start with Commissioner Zelenka.
I had the opportunity to meet Tom Tolles in San Francisco last year, and he, if you can't read this in the back, it says, the year 2060, the search for a breakthrough technology to solve the climate change continues, and the guy's talking to Uncle Sam. It's a time machine. We hope will take us back 50 years when we should have put a price on carbon. Tom wrote a book, a really good book that I'll commend to you in 2016 called The Madhouse Effect with Michael Mann of the hockey stick graph fame. And they talk about climate change and what is going on and what needs to be done. But sometimes, the conversation tends to end up being a conversation about this idea versus that idea. But I think actually Bill McKibben said it best when he said that there is no silver bullet to solve climate change. It's really silver buckshot. So it's really that buckshot idea that I wanted to get across today. It's going to take millions of separate actions to combat climate change. And it's not that we need to do an RPS or a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. We need to do them all in order to meet this. one of the chapters in Tolles and Mann's book talks about the soulless scientists who tell us that climate change isn't real, and if it is real, we can't afford to do anything about it because it's too expensive. And that's just patently false. The opposite is actually true. And it's true for, the opposite is true for two reasons. One is that when they talk about it being too expensive, they're only talking about half the equation. They left out the other half equation, which is the cost of doing nothing. The cost of doing nothing is not zero. The cost of doing nothing is actually extremely expensive, probably multiple times what it costs to actually take action. So the other reason that it's not true, that it's too expensive, is this graph. This is called the McKinsey graph. And it was a study done back in 2005 where they asked the McKinsey group to put together all the actions that you could do in the United States, how much they would save and how much they would reduce and how much they would cost or save. And as it turns out, that most of the stuff that you actually do, the line through the middle is zero cost. Most of the stuff that you can do actually it creates a net benefit, societal benefit and financial benefit. So said differently, we are better off doing those things than if we didn't do those things, and we're helping combat climate change. So most of the things that we start off doing actually are a net benefit to us. You don't start off doing the most expensive thing. You start off doing the most cost-effective thing, hopefully, if you have a plan. I was appointed to the Oregon Global Warming Commission by the governor to help our state meet our reduction goals. So we created our own little McKinsey curve. And ours isn't quite as nice as the one for the U.S., and it's also a little smaller. But it also has the same thing. Most of the things that we can do are net benefit to us, meaning we're better off having done them and not being done them on a financial basis. So again, it's not true that it's too expensive to take action. For Oregon, it's kind of a good news, bad news story. The good news is that we did this analysis, and the red line, the blue is the historic. The red line is the projection of the business as usual case, do nothing. And then the orange line is where we need to go in order to meet our statewide climate reduction goals. The trick is, how do you get there? Well, that's kind of a good news, bad news story for Oregon. Good news is we know how to get there. We know what things we need to do in order to get there. Unfortunately, the bad news is we don't have a plan to do it. We don't have the policies, the incentives, the programs, and the funding to actually get there. And that's where like Senate Bill 1070 comes into play. So our silver buckshot is what we call at the Global Warming Commission a wedge analysis. If we're trying to get from the red line down to the orange line, how do we fill that in? Well, we can do some energy efficiency. Then we can do some transportation projects. And then we can do materials and waste and help get us a little bit of that. Then we can do some stuff in the agricultural sector. And then we can do stuff in the power generation, the electric utility sector. But you'll notice, even after we've done all that stuff, and this is stuff that we know how to do, but we don't have programs to do them. That's the bad news part. Even with all that stuff we figured out, we still don't get to where we need to go, which is that orange line. And that's where the carbon tax comes in. At $60 a metric ton, the carbon tax actually allows us to get to our goal. And so the wedge analysis allows us to get there, but it's a whole bunch of different actions. The cool thing about this is that the carbon tax actually, the revenue come off the carbon tax actually pays for all of those other actions, as they're doing in California. If we're silly and stupid and divert all that to, say, K-12 or transportation or something else, building roads, then it won't work. But if we dedicate those revenues from the carbon tax back into all those actions we need to take in the other wedges, then we can actually get there. PSU did a study a while back, 2014, that actually, at the behest of the legislature, SB 306, to look at what's the economic impact of a carbon tax. And what they said, if you do it right, you can actually do it without, and we can achieve the reduction goals without hurting the economy, without having much of an impact on the economy, and that's kind of probably a lot of you going, duh. But to me, the question is not this: do we do a carbon tax? Do we do an RPS? It's all of the above strategy. It's kind of like President Trump's all of the above strategy, just different. At the slightly different. So that's at the state level. At the city level, we've got the climate recovery ordinance that we put into place. And what that did, put our existing targets into law and actually required an action plan to do it. We were the first city in the country to do that. Unfortunately, which surprisingly, we were the first ones to do that. It also established a new science-based target. Said, if we need to get the 350 parts per million by the year 2100, what do we need to do to get there? And we did the math, and the math said we have to reduce our carbon emissions 7.6% a year in this community every year in order to get there. So that's our science-based target. Our existing targets, our goals are 50% reduction of fossil fuels by 2030, and within the city government operations of the city, climate neutral by 2020. There's a lot of things that need to occur to do that, and in order to get there, we need to rely on things that are going to happen at the global level and at the national level, the large corporation level, but also at the state level through the plan that we have. And then there's all those things that still need to occur at the local level, and that's where the Climate and Energy Action Plan, CEAP, we did one back in 2010, and it was the best one in the country when we did it, but it's old. And what we're doing right now is we just started the process to revamp that and redo the CEAP 2.0, and we're going to have that by early next year with all the action that we need to take at the local level. As well, one of the things that we did was we were requiring that our transportation plan, our transportation system plan, which is, as you know, most of the greenhouse gases come from transportation and or cars and coal. Transportation and the automotive use of automobiles, transportation sector. So having our transportation system, transportation plan meet the goals of the CRO internally consistent, so that we know what we need to do in the transportation plan to meet our CRO goals, is one of the things we're working on over this next year. As well, we have our capital improvements program. That's the program or plan that we use to do to map out all of the things we're going to build in the city, the parks and all of the different things. And we need to have that plan also be consistent with meeting the targets. So we're working on building the CEAP 2.0 and integrating and incorporating our transportation and our capital building programs into making sure that they meet. All of this needs to be done in the all of the above strategy. You're up.
Thank you. So now we're going to transition to Representative Holvey.
Thank you. It seems he's done a pretty good job of looking at some of the state issues on that and all the expertise here. I am not a technical engineer or a technical scientist on these issues. I'm a legislator that has to absorb this sort of information to try to create the policies going forward, along with a few others and a few in the audience, Senator Beyer at least. And so I just wanted to touch, just really quickly on, what we're looking at in the upcoming session and going forward, and my perspective on why we're going this direction. And, we're trying to address climate change just generally, as everybody probably already knows. But with doing that, we're looking at climate change, and we really looked at really the cost of doing nothing, and it's becoming very apparent that our economy, not just our way of life, but our economy will suffer greatly if we do nothing. And so there's a huge momentum that we need to take action on this subject matter. There's been, at least as far as I can remember, a carbon tax or carbon pricing discussion in the legislature every session since 2007. And now it's 10 years later, and we are debating the fine points, which are really important, but we're debating these fine points of, oh, should we do this, should we do that? You know, and right now we've got a proposal that I think is ready to roll. I think it's ready to implement. And there will be some hiccups with it, just like there is with any legislation. There'll be things we have to come back and adjust going forward. But I think now is the time for us to really push this. And I think most legislators have come to the conclusion, and our proposed bills are recognizing a cap and trade model. We're looking more at a cap and invest sort of description of what this proposal does. And it is based on Senate Bill 1070, but there's been a lot of work in this last interim with our respective chairs from the Senate and the House doing joint work groups. Senator Beyer and I certainly participated in that quite a lot this last interim. And, you know, we started looking at this presentation is absolutely great. It actually informs me a little bit more. I learn something every time I sit down and go over this sort of material. But I want to, you know, reiterate that this was really looking at the electrical sector. And so when we're looking at a carbon pricing mechanism, we're looking at all our sectors and all our economy, and also the political reality of how do we get this done. You know, because I came to the conclusion long ago, and ex senator had a lot to do with this. You know, Chris Edwards as well. I came to the conclusion that a cap and trade model, cap and invest model is really the only logical way for Oregon to go. And it gives us the opportunity to join in the Western Climate Initiative with California, Quebec, and getting into a regional situation where we have a carbon pricing market that's really market driven, and also allows for different sectors to reduce their emissions and gives them also incentives to do so. But it also takes into account that we have some sectors like the agriculture, forestry sectors, which depending on their practices can have huge impacts to carbon pollution or sequestration. And Oregon actually has an opportunity to be a huge player especially with our forestry and agricultural practices of not just reducing emissions, but actually sequestering them, and with a more regional approach, enable this to grow in a much more direct way, I think. And we worry about a carbon tax, and I think the presenter referenced this. When you have different states with different carbon taxes set, it really becomes very difficult, and we would have problems with penalizing one part of our industry sector and just what we would consider leakage. They would just move to another state and create the pollution there. Well, globally, that doesn't solve anything. And so we really think this regional approach with more of a cap and trade model is the correct way to go. And we also think that it's more and more likely to drive the innovation that we will see coming forward that can actually change the dynamics of a more static analysis of it, that will be coming up with innovation where we may see more longer storage availability, and that could change, you know, the whole all these charts, you know, just by itself. And so when we're looking at this, we have, everybody knows Senate Bill 1070, but you'll soon forget that bill number because going forward, it's House Bill 4001 and Senate Bill 1507 from the Senate side that are going to be proposing this cap and invest model. There are some slight different nuances between the two bills. I like the House bill better. So I just wanted to, reiterate that when we're talking about this, just looking at the electrical sector, when we're looking at this, we have to look at the impacts, because if we have a certain industry sector that's just totally going to be hurt by this, we have to figure out how to mitigate that or how to adapt to it and how to prevent that leakage of the pollution just going across our state lines. And so I'm really excited about this particular model. I think it provides us a better opportunity to investing in vehicle electric charging stations to help drive that transportation section down. I can envision with climate change, we're going to be more stressed for water. We might be able to invest in piping irrigation canals in eastern Oregon and even in the valley if we need to. I don't know if there's any open ditches too much, but we lose a lot of water through evaporation. And water is going to be incredibly important to this dynamic. So it's just not looking at the specific carbon emissions or really we speak of it in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, which are equated to the metric tons in carbon. But so that's just sort of the big picture of what we're up against, just trying to mitigate all the issues that all the different industry sectors have, how to prevent the whole system from being gamed. And we have a tremendous amount to learn from what California has done. We've been down to California, talked with the Air Resources Board down there, legislators down there. The governor's office has been really good about helping us set up these sorts of meetings with their agencies and trying to understand how we can join with the Western Climate Initiative with California and the Canadian provinces that are involved in it right now. I wish Washington would go this same way. It would really be a much more powerful statement, but I think they kind of got tied with British Columbia long ago and went down that particular road.
1 more minute.
And I'll stop right there.
So, Jason, you're the last in the panel, which can be a benefit and a drawback. We need to be really tight on your time.
Yeah, we're going to clean up a lot of what you plan to say has been said by others, and it's been said well, so I won't repeat what others have said. But a few points. First off, one takeaway that it's really obvious in the analysis from E3, but I want to highlight it. It's that we can actually get to the 80% reduction in the electric sector with existing technology. We don't need unicorn technologies that don't exist yet. We can do it what we have in place today. I think that's really important because I think there are people out there that are skeptical about that. We know we can do it. We know it's not cost prohibitive, and certainly not when it's being netted against the cost of doing nothing and the societal and environmental costs of carbon emissions. So that's really great news to know that. And one thing I like about carbon pricing, whether it's cap and trade or carbon tax, I think it blends together very elegantly the best of what government can do and what market-based competition can do. Markets can be really efficient, and that's a good thing. That's their strength. But today, one thing the market doesn't account for is people are emitting carbon into the atmosphere for free. There's no cost in the economics. And yet we know there is a societal and environmental cost from those emissions, and it's rather substantial. So what I really like is I like the fact that market-based pricing, it's an opportunity for government to step in where the market has failed. Government can put a price on carbon and then step back out and let the efficiencies of the market choose the least cost options to decarbonize the sector. And I think that's a very elegant blend that gets us to that least cost approach to reducing carbon. And also the fact that government steps out and allows that market-based competition, that allows for local control. Any business, EWEB, the City of Eugene, They get to figure out how their entity can best respond to that carbon price signal, and yet we've got that carbon price, the certainty of the cap that we're going to meet our emission reductions. So I like the local control, and there's adaptability. The great thing about the market-based approach is we don't need a crystal ball where we need to try to forecast what are the right technology solutions to get there. That's adaptable. If certain technologies go down in cost or new technologies emerge, those will be the ones that rise to the top and help us get all the way to the end zone and that 80% reduction. So all in all, I think we intuitively at EWEB, we felt this way a long time ago, that market-based solutions would be the best ones. That hypothesis has been largely proven with the data in the E3 study. And additionally, we didn't talk about it tonight, but the 7th Power Plan for the Northwest, developed by the Northwest Power Council, reaches a lot of the same conclusions that you've heard tonight in the E3 analysis. So this is not the only study that's come to these conclusions. There's other material in this region verifying that conclusion. And I know we want to get to some great questions for the audience, so I'll wrap it up there.
Terrific. Thank you to the panelists. So now open for questions, and we would like to remind you of questions, not comments, for any one of the panelists. And Janine will bring you a microphone. Just raise your hand, and she'll bring you a microphone.
In the model, and maybe the panelists would like to comment on it also, natural gas was continued to be used. And my question has to pertains to a stranded asset. Once we get to 80%, we need to get to 100%. And we need to get to zero carbon, because carbon has a long residence time in the atmosphere. So I would think that people would look at the 40-year to 60-year lifetime of a carbon emitting natural gas power plant is not something they want to build, because they're going to be forced to shut it down since we need to get to 80%. So I would say that what is the point of looking at an 80% reduction without also looking at a 100% goal following it?
Yeah, well, so that's a great comment, and there's no magic out there saying 80% is exactly the right level from the electric sector. When we've done studies in California of the economy-wide, sort of what looks like the least cost pathway, we actually go beyond 80% in the electric sector to something more like 88 to 92 to 93% reductions. In the electric sector, it looks like it's cheaper to go that far versus what was available in buildings and industry and long-haul trucking and the sort of harder to decarbonize other end uses. So yeah, definitely goals beyond 80% should be looked at very, very carefully. Even in those cases, we still have natural gas generation there to make power when we really need it during the cold and dark days. So I don't know that I agree with the premise that those assets will become stranded if we still really need them and we can't have a reliable power grid without them. And again, without advances in very long duration storage, it looks like we still really need those assets. The other good thing about natural gas generators is that we don't need to think of them as a 40-year or a 50-year asset. Most of the gas generators that are out there today, they're relatively low cost to build. Now, they cost more to run, but if we're not going to run them very much, we don't care that much how much they cost to run. So they're very cheap to build, and a lot of them are being financed with 10-year or maybe 15-year debt financing or equity return assumptions. And so it's not really a 40 or 50-year asset. It's maybe a 10-year or a 15-year asset. And on that time frame, maybe then we have had some additional technology development that can allow us in 10 years or 15 years to re-ask these, continue to ask these same questions. And maybe by that time there's more viable economic alternatives.
So actually I think 78 is the right number. But that's because I graduated in 1978, and 78 is great, so that's the number I go with. Your study, though, Arnie, it assumes static technology, right? There's no increases in improvements in technology or new technologies that come into play. It's what we have today.
the technologies are what are available commercially today. Right. We are assuming continued declines in the cost of solar and wind and continued increases in the capacity factor of solar and wind resources and pretty big reductions in the cost of batteries as well. So.
Right. So there's going to be all these increases in battery technologies, especially not just multi-hour, but multi-week, multi-day storage. There's compressed air storage. There's pumped hydro. There's the Western Rockies wind turbines with a better transmission system could alleviate a lot of these problems. So there's a lot of things that are going to occur and should occur over the next 30 years that will help us get there. So that 7,000 megawatts of combustion turbines that is in the carbon cap scenario, I kind of look at that as a placeholder for, well, we need to be able to firm up the system and we need to make it reliable, but there's other ways to do that that will come into play. So it might not be that 7,000 megawatts and 11,000 of renewables is the way that it works out, because this is a static model. So we'll get improvements that will help us get there.
Next question.
Yeah. A question for Jason. Can you just comment briefly on the logic or the thinking behind not allowing utilities to count hydro as a renewable in their RPS portfolios?
Yeah, real quickly, I think the idea behind that was folks were very keenly aware that we have a lot of renewable resource in the form of hydropower in the region. It was about developing the next generation of renewables, partially for environmental benefits, but candidly, I think a lot of people were interested in Oregon's renewable portfolio standard law as an economic development strategy as well. And it certainly has delivered in that regard. There have been many jobs created. It's improved the property tax base for rural Oregon. The RPS probably was a good way to jumpstart change in the Pacific Northwest, to incent economic development, to support a relatively new industry, and to reduce some greenhouse gas emissions in the process. I think the flaw is it was probably never intended to be a policy that you would extrapolate and try to get all the way to an 80% reduction for all the reasons we've talked about tonight. So the RPS was a great policy at the outset. I think one modification that could be made to an RPS would be to make it more technology agnostic. And I will point out, there was an alternative scenario in 2007 when Oregon passed its renewable energy law. We could have actually set the target much higher and counted hydropower. And in hindsight, I kind of regret that we didn't do that. I feel like we may have kind of sent the wrong message at the time. It seemed like a very King Solomon compromise at the time to recognize that hydropower was important, but that it was a resource that was somewhat finite and we needed new renewables. So good policy at the time, but in hindsight, I think it would have been nice if we'd had a technology agnostic RPS that counted all carbon-free resources. And who knows what the future holds. Maybe that's something that could still be in the cards in the future.
But
Thanks, Jason.
It's also important to understand that when we were building the RPS years ago, that it was forward-looking as opposed to backward-looking. So it was about the incremental increases in energy they wanted. So it wasn't looking back at saying, yeah, good job on the low carbon, no carbon hydro. It was really about what moves forward. So hydro that is fish friendly and environmentally sensitive can be part of the RPS. So it's really about looking forward and what's the incremental resources. And that's why the definition's like that.
Great. Thank you. Next question.
I had a quick question for Representative Halvey and then a slightly longer one for Jason and Alan. Is there any sort of consideration for a green bank or revolving loan program for small-scale renewable projects that are technology agnostic? And what is the cities and EWEB's policy on working with independent power producers to, get projects streamlined and put onto a grid that's efficient for all the parties?
To the first question about the Green Bank and the revolving loan fund, yes, we have talked about that. I've proposed that, looking at that a couple of times. We have a program that's called the Small Energy Loan Program that we have talked about morphing a little bit into addressing. It basically could be a model for that green bank, I guess, concept. So that's in discussion. It isn't something that we've got ready to go quite yet. This discussion has sort of supplanted that a little bit. I know Senator Beyer and I have spent a lot of time on those particular topics, and we continue to work on some of those programs with the Department of Energy and DEQ, and just trying to put all of these pieces together. It is an incremental approach that the legislature takes. I mean, it isn't just this. The RPS was to try to get this renewable energy industry going because we knew we needed renewable energy, and hydro already existed, and hydro likely will maybe decrease potentially if we take out dams or we don't have enough water, and so we need some more backup besides just coal and gas. So and we have the Clean Fuels program. It's another incremental piece there to address that. So it's difficult to have all of those pieces on the table at the same time. But yeah, we've had those conversations. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. Also, I don't think you necessarily need a green bank if you have a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. That creates the revenue that then goes back into the reinvestment into those carbon reduction, greenhouse gas reducing projects. So in California, a cap and trade system has generated over $4 billion. And that money is being reinvested into the economy, into the transportation sector, into weatherization, into all these different renewables, all these kind of things that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So as long as it reduces greenhouse gas emissions, the money from cap and trade or the carbon tax can be used to fund those projects.
Yeah, and that's an important point. The model that we looked at, shows we looked at the economic impact that California's had, Quebec and Ontario, and they've all had positive impacts to their economies because of the cap and trade system. So we've had people up, the agriculture community, Chamber of Commerce from California, all telling us that very thing. So
yeah, California reduced their emissions over 20% and grew the economy, and had one of the fastest growing economies in the country.
All right. Next question.
All right. Thanks. First, thanks to EWEB for doing the research or sponsoring the research in part, and then for hosting this forum. It's really helpful. And thanks to E3 for the analysis. It's interesting. Question on the modeling. It's great to see that you're assuming a high proportion of electric vehicles over time. It seems like that's kind of an obvious direction we're going. But if I read it right, the base case doesn't actually show electrification of natural gas that's currently used for home heating and commercial heating. And I'm curious why that decision is an assumption, and then how, if we were to assume electrification of that natural gas, how that might change things. I have a second question that's separate if there's time.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question. And sometimes when we do this, we start with an economy-wide pathways analysis where we look at how much electrification we expect to see from all the different sectors, add that new load onto the electric sector, and then build out the electric portfolio to meet all of the existing and all of the new loads. And that can have a very large impact. We just completed an analysis for the California Energy Commission where we found that electric load would grow by 50% relative to the reference case with all of the new loads that are being added on. That's obviously a really, really big increase in the amount of wind and solar we would need in California to meet the long-term economy-wide goals. I think that's a good next step for the Northwest. We didn't have that Northwest-wide pathways model to start from. I think it felt like enough from the PGP perspective just to sponsor this study looking at the electric sector only, but I think that's a really important next step.
Next question.
Let me kick it up a level here. This is for you, Representative Hovey, as well as for you, Senator Byers. We've known most of these facts for at least 4 years. The legislature has failed to act despite being prodded by the citizens. And now you're patting yourselves on the back, and perhaps appropriately so, for finally getting something in the queue that you might pass. At what point is the legislature going to treat this as the emergency it is and start really dealing with it?
Well, I will, the legislature is made up of 90 people, and, it's been an emergency. I introduced the first carbon tax in 2007 and have been pounding the table ever since. Senator Byers been involved in these discussions as well. We have a lot of folks from Eastern Oregon and business representatives who have political power, and their votes are oftentimes represented in these committees. And we live in a democracy. Sometimes we can't get it done.
Next question.
Excuse me, a question for Arnie. I wonder if let me back up. We're tied together with states all across the West, so power can flow not just between Oregon and Washington and California, but all the states. I wonder if you've thought at all, not necessarily just in the model, but beyond that, about the impacts of policies from Montana, from Idaho, from Wyoming, and how they might impact any policy path that we might take.
Yeah, so right now, those states aren't going down the same path. There was a time 10 years ago when there were a series of Republican governors in the Rocky Mountain states that looked at the economic benefits from promoting wind and solar development in their states, and there was a big sort of West-wide pro-renewable, movement among state governments. That since 2008, the rise of the Tea Party, those times feel like a long time ago sometimes. But I think we'll get back there. I think eventually when the politics dies down, I think people will go back to looking at what their own interests are and what good policy is rather than just good politics. And when we get there, I think we really are well set up in the West to do deep decarbonization in a really good way. We have a big Western grid. It's very robust. We have world-class wind resources in the Rocky Mountain area. We have some of the world's best solar resources in the Southwest. We have all the Northwest hydro that we can use to help back that up and store it and balance it, and this big, robust grid that ties us all together. I think we really are well set up if we were to do it and think about this from a regional perspective to do it in a low-cost and smart way.
Thank you. Next question.
So I just want to thank the panelists. I feel, based upon what you've said today, I feel well represented in the State House and on the City Council, so I appreciate that. And I appreciate hearing the comments from EWEB. I thought I was really quite delighted to hear you're embracing the cap-and-trade proposal. I guess my key question is, we're at an EWEB event, we're in an EWEB building, we have a study funded by EWEB. Does EWEB have a position on this legislation that's currently pending in the legislature?
So for EWEB, first off, our board adopted a resolution in 2013, and I'm sure we were the first utility in Oregon, and maybe the first in the region even, to embrace carbon pricing in principle. And so we have a set of principles that we adopted and reaffirmed most recently at our December 6th board meeting, give or take a day. And we have not taken a final position on the bill. There's a House and Senate bill. They both just came out on Monday. I've seen enough in earlier drafts that I think we feel very comfortable that the structure of the cap-and-trade bills, both in the House and Senate, I think we might lean towards the House version a little bit for the point of regulation, for example, being more upstream, where we think that'll have a better impact in actually changing the way electric resources are dispatched in the West. But both bills, we think, measure up very closely with the set of principles that our board has adopted. So I think we'll want to see the final version of the bill, but it measures up very nicely with the set of principles our board has entrusted us with.
You're not going to hear that from the investor-owned utilities.
This question is directed to any of you. I am alarmed to see that all of the models continue to rely on nuclear energy. And if we're talking about societal cost, there certainly is a societal cost with nuclear energy, particularly looking at Fukushima and the fact that the Columbia Generating Station has the exact same model as that plant. So I'm wondering if we could perhaps have a nuclear pricing system included in our look at the future.
Well, I'll take a stab at that. I agree with you. I think until we can figure out, how to deal with the waste of nuclear energy, we shouldn't be building or using it. Having said that, it doesn't really come into the question, I guess, of this particular proposal or legislation. I think that would be a separate concept to go forward and pull it out. I think his model contemplated that happening in that one slide, along with a few dams. So, I think that's a discussion, but I'm certainly not going to get hung up in that debate and watch this one fizzle because of getting sidetracked with that right now.
One of the study assumptions is that all the existing nuclear and coal plants, except for the ones that have announced retirements, are assumed to be in the study. So the study didn't try to tackle whether or not those should go away. It said, what are we going to do from here? So that you could call that a fault of the study, but it's just an assumption that they made in order to move forward. I agree with what you said. There's been no new nuclear power plants since 1978 in the United States because they're so darn expensive. There's one right now, I think it's in Georgia, that is being developed, and it is so far over cost that, like fourfold over cost, that it's going to be one of the most expensive. Yeah, 2-unit plant, but it's going to be so far over cost. Yet the PUC in that state said, yeah, go ahead and make it, let it go, and keep putting good money after bad. If we did the true cost accounting for nuclear, we wouldn't have any more new nuclear plants. I think this lesson we're going to hear from Georgia is they're so darn complicated and they're so expensive that they're going to die of their own weight. So I'm not going to spend much energy worrying about new nukes. I'm more worried about how do we get all this other stuff to get to the all of the above strategy going.
Okay, we're going to take one last question.
Hi, I did want to first just thank our local legislators and as well as the city and EWEB for being supportive of carbon pricing. It's really great to have local leadership in this way. So I know that there's a lobby day in support of this legislation on February 12th being hosted by Renew Oregon that community members are invited to. Rep. Holvey, I guess, what is the best way to have an impact on getting this bill passed? Is it writing and calling legislators? Is it lobby days like that? What can you say?
Yeah, I think emails are probably the most effective, but having a presence in the building with folks that are speaking to it and having your best people speak in the public hearings as well, making your points when these bills come up is also important. But with the communications systems we have now, email is the most direct and most massive way to get that communication to legislators. It's oftentimes difficult to get meetings with legislators during session. We really don't have an extreme amount of time during session to accommodate very many meetings just because of our workload, the committee schedules, the floor schedules, and all the other duties we have up there. You can always talk to our staff, too, if you drop by.
Thank you to everyone. You've been a wonderful audience. If you did not get a question answered that you wanted to have answered, there is a section on your agenda to put a question there, and they will post answers on the website, or if you request for them to get back to you, they'll get back to you. I'm going to let Frank close us out really quickly before you go.
Well, it looks like everybody's about closed out. I would like to thank our panel. Appreciate them being with us. I would also like to thank Arnie Olson for the investment and the visit to Eugene. Thank you, Arnie, for the information. If this is one of those subjects, the more you dive into, the more answers you get and the more questions you have. There is a 300-page technical report that you can get that we have links on the website. Just so you know, the first time I saw this presentation with Arnie, we were developing it. It was 92 slides long, so you were lucky to get the condensed version. That presentation is also available via our website if you'd like the long version. But mostly, thank you for your time. We appreciate you coming out this evening. We appreciate our panel. And keep the questions coming. Thank you.